And as we pursue our own process of truth and reconciliation here in this country, we hope that her insights can benefit us. So I ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela.
Good afternoon, everyone. There was talk when we were in conversation on email with Jessica and Sean about bringing me up here in October. I must say I'm really pleased that I didn't come in October because it would have been much colder than it is, so I'm really very delighted about that. One of the things that also pleases me is when English-speaking people can pronounce my name with ease, as if they speak my language. So thank you very much. I have not heard any adulteration of my name since coming here, so I'm very pleased about that. I am conscious of the great honor that the director of the Mauro Center, Dr. Sean Byrne, and the rector of St. Paul's College, Dr. Dennis Bracken, have conferred upon me when they invited me to deliver the 8th Saul Kanee Lecture on Peace and Justice. I am humbled and privileged to be standing before you today and to be given the opportunity to follow in the footsteps of previous speakers who, like Saul Kanee himself, have distinguished themselves as citizens of the world and as leaders of stature inspired by a sense of justice and a desire to make a difference in their communities and in the broader society. I consider it a wonderful blessing to join your community today here at the University of Manitoba and to be counted among the heirs of this great heritage that citizen Kanee has bestowed upon us. I am deeply grateful to you, Sean, and to the rector, Dr. Bracken, for this great honor. Thank you to the Vice Chancellor, Dr. Barnard, for the warm welcome. I am really delighted and feel so very special that you delivered this wonderful piece of music that is so emotionally moving. Thank you very much. Thank you to you and to Mr. Riley, whom I didn't get a chance to thank before he went back to his seat. I really am grateful to you both. Thank you. It is a profound and deeply heart-warming moment for me to be welcome to your country and to your university in this way. Today I'm going to speak with you about forgiveness and the journeys of healing that people take after mass atrocities, journeys that sometimes seem impossible to take. I'm going to draw on work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that great national project of my country that became a national storytelling process. I have been very inspired to hear from some of you, and especially from Sandra, who picked me up this morning, about the storytelling work that you do here at Winnipeg, that especially Jessica at the center, Mauro Center, has done and has been leading with this project of storytelling for a few years now. This is very similar to what the Truth Commission did in my country. And I find a wonderful opportunity of connecting that work of storytelling with what we are trying to do in my country to rebuild and to strengthen the connections that were started by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have something to learn from that process in my country, and thank you very much for that great example. In recent years, there has been a growing interest in the role of truth commissions in dealing with past atrocities and the capacity for truth commissions to create opportunities of lasting peace. For the first time in history of dealing with past atrocities, forgiveness became acceptable, albeit a contested outcome of reconciliation processes in divided societies emerging from violent conflict. Stories of forgiveness that emerged at Truth and Reconciliation public hearings were primarily personal. Their telling in public, however, imbued them with the significance of a collective enterprise, inspired at its core by a communal ethics. The debates about forgiveness in politics have been characterized by notions of the unforgivable, a perspective inspired by the insights that Hannah Arendt described in her book, The Human Condition, and her analysis of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Arendt's thesis was that radical evil, the kinds of acts committed by perpetrators in the service of oppressive, murderous, and genocidal state policies, are unforgivable. After South African stories of forgiveness and reconciliation at Truth Commission hearings, however, and after stories of reconciliation and forgiveness in Rwanda, this perspective of the unforgivable has to be rethought a bit. The example of forgiveness and reconciliation witnessed in both South Africa and Rwanda forces us to rethink this idea that there are some acts that are unforgivable and acts that are even unapologizable, as Hannah Arendt argued. Understanding what it is about the contexts that open up the possibility for victims of surviving family members to reach out to perpetrators of atrocities that were committed against their loved ones would enrich the debates about the alternative strategies to peace building in the aftermath of violence and political conflict. This is very important for us to do because we are venturing into a terrain that is a terrain that was never imagined before. The model that we've heard about dealing with the past atrocities, dealing with histories of violence in countries that have practiced systematic abuses against people who are considered to be inferior, is the model of the Nuremberg trial. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and in particular, the model of the Truth Commission of the South African process, introduced a new language in the debates about how to deal with the past and how victims and survivors heal from these past atrocities. It also taught us that perpetrators, when given the opportunity to reclaim their sense of humanity, the opportunities to restore their own brokenness, they can rise up to the occasion, rise beyond their sense of guilt, which so often is avoided and even denied. And instead of denying the guilt and hiding away from the shame, confront their shame and face it and experience a sense of remorse for the deeds that they've committed in the past. This is new in the history of atrocities. At least it came into public discourse for the first time, and we witnessed how it unfolded on the stage of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. These stories that emerged in South African Truth Commission are significant not only because they set a precedent. Even more important is that these stories that we witnessed at TRC hearings were illustrative of the moral imagination that unfolds when there is openness to engage with the other and to discover the possibilities of human connection that can help people break the cycles of violence that so often repeat themselves historically. Remorse, of course, is a very central piece in these stories of forgiveness. Remorse by perpetrators who, when they face their past truthfully, and when they can go deep into the depths of their conscience, admit and acknowledge that they had silenced the voice of conscience in their hearts for many years, and now they can face the truth and reclaim their position among other moral beings. Forgiveness carried with it a sense of responsibility, this response of forgiving a perpetrator who is remorseful. It showed a sense of responsibility that was driven by a desire not for vengeance, but for the higher priority of responsibility to the human community. The public hearings of the Truth Commission imbued the dialogue process with a concept of human community that extended to others, even to perpetrators, for as long as they showed that they cared, that they recognized their crime, and they were ready to embrace their accountability through the expression of remorse. This inclusive concept of humanity recognizes that as an expression of being human, remorse transcends the evil deeds of the perpetrator. Remorse cannot be evil. Remorse is an important bridge for the victim and the victim's surviving family members to reach out to the perpetrator. It presents the perpetrator as a wounded human other. It is a kind of a paradox when the perpetrator expresses a sense of remorse, because remorse is a kind of self-punishment. When once a perpetrator expresses this sense of remorse, they are in a paradoxical way presenting themselves as the wounded other, the other who is suffering because, or showing a sense of suffering and responsibility for the deeds that they committed in the past. And it is this kind of dialogue that is not the adversarial kind of dialogue that we often see and witness in the courts of law. It's a different kind of dialogue, one that invites human engagement in the context of tragedy. Dialogue, of course, will not solve every problem faced by a society that has suffered sustained violence on a large scale. However, it can create avenues for broadening commonly accepted models of justice and of healing deep fractures in a nation by unearthing, acknowledging, and recording a brutal past. Dialogue allows victims and survivors to revisit the sites of trauma. It humanizes victims and confronts perpetrators with their inhumanity. Through dialogue, victims, as well as the greater society, comes to recognize perpetrators as human beings who failed morally, whether through coercion, the perverted convictions of a warped mind, or fear. Far from relieving the pressure on perpetrators, as we often hear about these stories of forgiveness, when they're criticized as letting the perpetrators off the hook. Far from that, recognizing the most serious criminals as human intensifies the pressure, because society can then hold them to greater moral accountability. Indeed, demonizing as monsters those who have committed horrific deeds lets them off too easily. Managed carefully, dialogue condemns, but not too hastily, lest it foreshortens the accountability process and perversely excuse the criminal by dismissing him into the category of the hopelessly, radically other. Sustained, engaged, ordered dialogue thus forces an offender to unearth what moral sensibilities he has buried under the facade of obedience to orders or righteous duty to my country, and rather to face what he has done in the sobering atmosphere of reflection on ordinary human lives now shattered. Dialogue invites the perpetrator to negotiate the chasm between his monstrousness and the world of the forgiven. The act of humanizing perpetrators is therefore at once both punishment and rehabilitation. Finally, dialogue creates the possibility of setting the perpetrator's actions through testimony and witnessing in the broader framework of the political, ideological context that may have supported and even directed his deeds. On the scale of horrible things that can happen to people, there are some for which the language of apology and forgiveness may be entirely inappropriate. To say, however, that horrific deeds committed in the context of systemic human rights abuses by states are simply unforgivable does not capture the complexity and richness of all the social context within which gross human rights violations are committed. There may be value in recognizing and posting the limits of forgiveness, if such exist. In societies where victims and perpetrators have to live together in one country, it may be more constructive to focus on discovering and nurturing the conditions that make forgiveness first conceivable, then ultimately possible. Of course, in order to set conditions for forgiveness, it does indeed bear asking. When someone has committed the kinds of radically evil acts that Hannah Arendt spoke about, what does remorse mean in the context of these kinds of deeds? How do we judge the genuineness of that remorse? How does one forgive unless one can find claims of remorse credible? In addition, how does one find them credible unless one first attempts to understand why the acts were committed? How do we know that the signs of alleged contrition are not simply a product of the perpetrators having been caught or of changes within the society that have destroyed his power base and support structures and have left him vulnerable? How do you know that these are genuine? Some of these questions have to do with the moral possibility, the psychological and epistemological possibility of achieving authentic remorse in the wake of having performed the unthinkable and the unspeakable. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? T.S. Eliot asks in Gerontian. The question is quite legitimate, yet it remains equally legitimate that when perpetrators do in fact express remorseful regret, guilt, or contrition, however it may be ascertained, what seems to lie, as Nicholas Tavuchis has put it, beyond the purview of an apology, and what Hannah Arendt has referred to as the unforgivable, can in fact be transformed from an unforgivable deed into a forgivable one. In other words, the narrative that unfolds in the dialogue about the past may be along the lines of, this has happened, and we must find ways to move forward. Philosophical questions such as the so-called moral inappropriateness of forgiveness can and should give way and be subsumed to human questions. For in the end, we are a society of people and not of ideas, a fragile web of interdependent human beings, not of stances. Now, I want to illustrate some of the points I have made in my discussion so far with an actual story of forgiveness that occurred at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings. This story is based on an event that in South Africa came to be known as the Guguletu 7 event. Guguletu is one of the townships in the Cape Town area. And these young men were brutally, 7 young men were brutally murdered by the apartheid security police in South Africa. Now, their murder was created as an attack by the state on terrorists who were about to attack a state target. What actually happened, and this became known at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that the government worked with a black collaborator to infiltrate a group of young activists in the township who, like many young people in those years, were very angry and wanted to do something to change the situation and to bring about freedom for their people. The government conducted these kinds of operations all over the country. They worked with black collaborators who were paid to infiltrate communities of young activists and to provide them with firearms and grenades and to train them in the use of these firearms and grenades. These were young people who have never held a gun before. Now, in this case, a young man who worked with the police went into the community and pretended that he came from exile, from the ANC in exile, and was sent by the leaders of the liberation movement to train groups of young men to fight the apartheid government. What unfolded is that then the state police and the security police identified a target where these young men were actually lured into a trap to be killed by the police. And so, believing that they were trained to fight the government and the army of the government, they went with the collaborator. And the moment they came to this target spot, they were shot brutally. Some of them, they were shot as they held up their hands in surrender. They did not know that they were lured into a trap. They died brutally, some of them with gunshots behind their heads because they were running away. The state presented this story as one of the success stories of the security operatives' fight to destroy terrorism in South Africa. And that is how the story was presented in the news for many months and weeks. We knew, however, we already knew, many of us knew, that this was a government strategy to target black people in order to boost up the budgets of the security forces that were operating covertly, training death squads to kill black people who were fighting the system of apartheid. Now, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, some perpetrators came forward and asked us to arrange for them to meet victims of their crimes. And this is what happened in this case. This black man who was a collaborator came to testify to the Truth Commission to apply for amnesty and to disclose what he had done, who gave them the orders, because these are the conditions that the commission has set out to grant amnesty to perpetrators, black and white perpetrators. In the course of his testimony at the Truth Commission, he asked to meet with the mothers of the 7 young men, and we organized this encounter between him and the young mothers. I worked with the mothers for a week to prepare them for the meeting, and I spent a day with this young man to understand what he wanted to achieve and to make sure that the experience was not going to re-traumatize the families. At the event where that we organized for him to meet with the mothers, he explained to the mothers what had gone on, and asked them to ask for their understanding. Now, I'm going to just describe some of the highlights of this encounter between this young man and the mothers. You are going to see a short 10-minute or so video clip of this incident. But what happened then, and one of the most striking moments of this encounter is that this young man, in speaking to the mothers, who were very angry, they called him a wolf dressed in sheepskin, that as a black person, he should have been the one to protect his black brothers, but he betrayed his black brothers. The mothers were very angry. For some time during their meeting, the mothers were very angry. There was a turning point moment during this dialogue, if one might call it that, when this young man turned to the mothers and said, "My parents, I want to ask your forgiveness for what I have done." And he explained that, "I know that this is not something easy that I'm asking you to do, but I ask you, my parents, to forgive me. I ask you from the depths of my heart, from the bottom of my heart." Now, these are very strange words, strange in the sense that someone who has killed your child can then call you my parent. This is something that will never be heard of in any other cultural context. Yet, moved by the words of this man and moved by empathy for him, the mothers responded likewise with a sense of forgiveness and with a connection to this young man that said, "We forgive you." One of the mothers who spoke first referred to the young man as "my child." She said, "My child, my son, you are the same age as my son Christopher, whom he killed. I want you to know that today, I, as Christopher's mother, I forgive you, my child." And it's really so profound to listen to the words of this mother's forgiveness, because she doesn't say it once. She says it, she repeats it many times, about 5 times, in different ways. The word in my language, forgive, is uxolo. She says this several times. "I forgive you, my son. Ndiyakuxolela, ndixolile." And the word means I forgive, I am at peace, I free you to go on in life. It means all of these things. And the mother conveyed these words of forgiveness in this very profound way, referring to him as my son and my child. These are the questions for me that have exercised my mind to ask not only what does forgiveness mean, but rather to ask, where does it issue from? What happens to a person who has been wounded so irreparably that they can find it in their hearts to reach out in this way with such profound statement of forgiveness? How do we understand that? My research has been about answering that question. And I realize, of course, as we all do, those of us who engage in qualitative research, that sometimes the way in which you ask the questions deals you with the kinds of answers that your questions have framed. And so often when you're not satisfied, you realize that I must ask the question differently. So I started to ask the question differently, and I asked the mothers, what happens to you? What happens to your body when you reach out to someone with forgiveness? And this was born out of my witnessing and watching over and over again the video clip that told the story of this forgiveness. And it became clear to me that there's something about our bodies that when we are separated from others, when we cut ourselves from others, we cut ourselves off even with our body. We distance ourselves. We feel we don't connect. And we have these kind of body language that says, I don't want to come close to you. And some of the metaphors we use for distancing are metaphors that use the body. For example, keeping someone at arm's length. When I started doing this work and speaking to some perpetrators, some people would say, I would not touch them with a long pole linked to my long arm. So there is like that sense of our bodies are also the language of connection or disconnection with others. And so I asked the mothers to explain to me whether they could explain to me whether there's any shift in their bodies. Because when you approach this kind of person who's killed your loved one, you approach them with a lot of anger and hate, and the mothers demonstrated that anger when they first encountered this man. They were very angry and they expressed their anger. And so there must be a shift at some point that invites them to engage with him in this way, through this language of, you are my child. And so I asked, what is the sign that they feel? What is the sign that they sense that draws them into this place of forgiveness? And from my interviews with the mothers, the one sign that has emerged most prominently is a language that in my language, is a word that in my language means the umbilical cord. The word umbilical cord in my language is inimba. And when we speak about a mother having inimba for their child, we mean that something moves inside of you and tells you that there's something happening to your child. Sometimes parents, mothers experience inimba even if the child is far away. They feel that there's something going on and they need to pick up the phone and find out what's going on. That, in my language, is that connection, inimba, the umbilical cord, which really doesn't capture adequately what that word means. What feels exceptional about this concept, inimba, as explained by the mothers to me, is I believe that it allowed for an experience of empathy for their sons' killers, and ultimately for the act of forgiveness to emerge from that experience of empathy. To feel this sense of inimba is to feel like a mother does for a child wherever the child may be. Now, we can ask the question, what is the place of cultural expression, of cultural language here? Is this expression of inimba confined to certain kinds of cultures where a young perpetrator has the possibility to call the parents of his victims my parents, and for the family members of victims to refer to a perpetrator as my son? Is this an act that is located only in certain kinds of cultures? I must point out here that by raising this question of culture, my aim is not to racialize the experience of inimba, which really essentially is the experience of human empathy. I don't want to fall into the trap of reductionism and essentialism. In my discussion elsewhere of these concepts, I have argued that this really is the essence of being human. It's the essence of connection to another human being. There is also another concept in my country or in the African continent that is referred to as Ubuntu, which describes the essence of being human. Again, this notion of Ubuntu has often been associated with an African ethos, an African culture. And yet, I think that Ubuntu is an experience that traverses cultural, religious, and racial boundaries. It is the feeling of inimba, an embodied connection with one's child emanating from the womb. However, it is also the feeling of human connection embodied within ourselves as human beings, one to another. Now, we may ask the question, would this experience of encounter with a perpetrator be different if the racial groups were different? If perpetrator was white or the victim was a white family, would it be different? Fortunately, we have many examples on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that illustrate exactly the same kind of engagement, which to me means it really is about being human. Just a very quick example is from another story. Davi Ackerman, an Afrikaans man in South Africa whose wife was murdered during a bombing operation that was conducted at a large church in Cape Town, the St. James Church. The incident came to be known as the St. James Massacre. Davi Ackerman at the Truth Commission faced the young perpetrators. Now, these men had expressed apologies to Davi Ackerman for the bombing operation. And Davi said to them, I've read what you've written in these documents, but I want you to turn around and look at me in my face and tell me that you are sorry for what you did. And each one of the men, in turn, expressed their apology. And one of the very profound things that Davi told them, he said, I want you to say it in your language. I don't know your language, but I want you to express the apology that you have written in the documents in your own language. You can imagine the importance for him of the communication of how they felt as they were expressing their apology. That was important for him. So every one of them said, I'm sorry, and they expressed their apology. And then he turned to them and said, I accept your apology, and there's one thing I'd like you to do for me. I'd like you to tell me whether you remember shooting at my wife. And he described his wife. He said, my wife was wearing a long blue coat, and she was sitting next to me when she was shot. Do you remember shooting at her? Now, we know the chances of these people remembering shooting at one individual in a church full of 1,000 people is almost non-existent. But for Davi to remind the perpetrators that they shot a woman, a human being, it was not just a settler, it was a human being. He wanted them to memorialize his wife, to remember her in the same way that he did as a human being, a woman that he loved. And of course they didn't know. But that moment of engagement with this man for Davi led him to forgive these men. And he said, I forgive these men, and I am satisfied that they mean their apology. That is the significance of these human moments. Now, I want to end my presentation by really building a kind of an emphasis on this theme of the humanness of these moments, that these moments, while cultural language enables us to perhaps have a deeper understanding of what happens when people are moved into these kinds of acts, it is nonetheless an act that human beings all over the world can engage in. It is not something that only people of a certain cultural group engage in. And I found the work of the scholar, of the philosophical scholar, Emmanuel Levinas, very useful in understanding exactly this idea that these are human moments. The idea that we are created for connection, for connectedness to one another, is a reality that is ruptured because of laws, because of violent acts. Otherwise, the human connection is something that we are created for. Now, Emmanuel Levinas' ethics begins with this notion of a face-to-face encounter with another. In other words, looking at another and discovering, or rather rediscovering, the humanity of the person, of the other. When approached by the other, he says, one is confronted with the absolute otherness and precariousness of the other, an otherness that escapes all comprehension. This precariousness and otherness is expressed in the face of the other. Not only does Emmanuel Levinas' ethics maintain that subjectivity is realized by the encounter with the other as a human other, but also that the face-to-face encounter is an ethical relation in which the subject, quote, comprehends the other through a discourse of response and responsibility. His main thesis is that we have responsibility. The other may have an otherness in terms of being different to us, but we are drawn into community with the other because we are connected as human beings. Now, it's interesting that Emmanuel Levinas uses this concept of the maternal body. I described earlier on this idea of inimba and how mothers are drawn through inimba to forgive. Now, Emmanuel Levinas uses the maternal body to illustrate the importance of responsibility for the other as human beings. What's interesting about his position on this question of responsibility for the other is that responsibility for the other requires that we bear the other like a maternal body. And to bear someone like a maternal body suggests that one need not be a mother or indeed a woman to bear responsibility for the other. Levinas, of course, by including men in the ethical imperative to bear others, uses maternity as a metaphor for ethics of responsibility towards the other. Now, the relevance here of these Levinasian ethics, of their relationship to the notion of Ubuntu, which is the cultural, or rather the African concept of recognizing the humanness of the other, I think offers a unique contribution to the ongoing dialogue about forgiveness and reconciliation. Both the concept of Ubuntu and Emmanuel Levinas' idea of responsibility for the other can be conceived of as dialogical, as a framework for understanding forgiveness and reconciliation. It can be viewed as a process that opens up the possibility for engagement. We do not know. It is taking a risk. We don't know what's going to unfold, but at least we ought to begin. We ought to create those spaces for the storytelling, for the connection with others, because there, in that place, between us and them, we might rediscover the connection to one another as fellow human beings. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a video clip to show. Do we have time for that? It's about 10 minutes. Do we have to? While they are setting the video clip up, I was invited to dinner by the Mauro Center and the rector, by Sean and the rector of St. Paul's. And one of the guests that I was fortunate to sit next to, Archbishop Weisberger. I told him that in South African language, we would probably call him Weisberger. And we had this conversation about the importance of this work. And I was reminded again that really what it boils down to sometimes is just a very basic biblical injunction of love thy neighbor. It sounds like, it's too religious. We really don't want to go there because it's so religious. But really, it is the essence of, human relationships, love thy neighbor. So thank you. Are we ready for the video clip?
Nginguthaphela umpelo ligama. Dinamahloni nami ukunijonga nje ebusweni. Ndayazi ba kubhlungu. Ujonga umuntu ukwenzela ubube ukuthi ungathetha naye veri. Ndayazi ndizawuxela ixolo, abanye bazawundixolela, abanye ngeke bandixolele. ndayazi ndizawufa nam ndinalonto ukuba nyani ke ndayenza ububi nami apha emhlabeni. Into ebendicelayo bengisithi abazali bonke baba labantwana bebephaya la mina, ndixola uxolo ukusuka ngaphakathi kwenhliziyo yami. Ndiyaxolela abazali bami.
Ezazidumbu zazileli pha kabuhlungu nizinyathela, athi umntana enyuse izandla esithi ndicela uxolo ndiyanikezela, kodwa nimdubule ngaphezulu koba ezinikezela umntana, kodwa nimdubule. Ufila njani xa ngalamini wawubona elanto pha kwividiyo, wafila njani? Yayinto ebuhlungu kuwo. How much more kuthi bazali babantwana kwakunjani ke kuthi? Uyandibona mna namhlanje, uyandibona ndingakanani? Khame ndime ngenyawo. Uyandibona ndingakanani? Ndandityebile. Uyandibona unqina kwam? Ndandityebile. Wena kokwenu konwatyiwe, akho nto ingekhoyo, kuba ufumana imali ezinjengemali ngenxa yobulalisa igazi lakho. Ufila njani ukubulalisa igazi lakho? Endani uba ngengowudifenda igazi lakho, wabona uba mawubulala igazi lakho ngenxa yemali qha. Thengise ngegazi lakho ngenxa yemali. Ndimile kuloo ndawo.
Bendinyanzekile babesama nambe kwenye imeko endingeke ndiwazi ukuba ndingayibamba phi ndiyeke phi, because nasemotweni bekhona abamhlophe vele. Bendicelelwa, bendingaceleli mna.
Kodwa ndiyayicinga laa nto uba ikhona laa nto uba ngabantakwethu aba, le nto izokwenza uba baza kufaka kade ngoku. Laa nto kuwe ngoku uthi woyijonga ivakala njani kuwe nangelaa xesha xa ubajongile nangelo mhla ke ngoku bawa ngayo. Ithini isazela sakho xa sobajongile tata?
Mama kwangoku siyambetha, siyanilimaza.
Kubuhlungu kum ngaphakathi kuba noba beyintoni ukumtsala ngalaa hlobo ngathi nja abelungkhona uba kuthiwa yibhom. Laa ruphu bebeyiphethele uba mababulala umntana, bamtsala ngalaa hlobo bamtsala ngalo. Laa nto mos ngoku ingena kuthi ngaphakathi. Umntana wakhe lamshileyo utya ntoni? Ufunda songubani? Babekude ngoku namabhula abafuna uba banikeni inkamnkam. Uba mabatye abantwana aba, thina sihleli asiphangeli asithini. Kubuhlungu kuthi ngoku.
Okay. Ubuhle owabenzayo soze ndibulibale, ngoba nalo ngicolo lakho, ngoba umntanam yeqhela undiphangelela ebezisindisa kobu buqabane bakhe. Wayezisindisa kuba ebesebenzela inkululeko le wena ubungayisebenzeli, busebenzela amabhulu wena nabazali bakho nabantwana bakho. Yayeka.
Just kancinci tata. Ndiyaqonda uthaphela ndithi ngumthandazo. Yintoni uthaphela elo gama? Yabona ndiyaqonda igama lakho. Ndani noma ndizathi ulilande noba kulilandelangani. Mna njengoba ndingumama kaChristopher nje ndiyakuxolela mntanam kuba ke ndiyaqonda uba uyintanga inye noChristopher ungumntana kum. Ndiyakuxolela mntanam kuba ke unobangela ndithi ndiyakuxolela umntanam akasoba savuka, soba phinda avuke. Akuncedi noba kusokuthiwa ndisibambile isilonda sakho ndakufana naso. Thixo uyawundigweba ngaloo nto kuba kuthi abaxolela abasonayo njengoba nathi sibaxolela apha. Ke ndiyakuxolela Thaphela, ndifuna uthi noba uyahamba uyagoduka ugoduka uthi noko oomama ndiyaqonda naba mama uyazixolela zonke into esikuphosakala siza bubuhlungu. Akho mntu ndawo besinakho uzigibisela kuwe kufuneka sizigibisele kuwe noba ezinye azenziwanga nguwe sowufana nabo sowucela uyesu ubethelele emnqamlezweni ezo zono sesizigibisela kuwe sixolele kuba ngoku sifuna ukukhupha le nto ilapha kuthi nathi ngengoku sawuthi noba sifike emakhaya sihle mna ngokukwelam indawo ndiyakuxolela mntanam ndiyaxolela uhambe kakuhle mntanam.
Zolale ngoxolo lale ngoxolo
Thank you, Dr. Gobodo-Madikizela, for your words and for your humanity.